Questions orales, oral questions. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday Statistics Canada said that Alberta has lost more jobs than in any year since 1982. Many Albertans don't know where the next paycheck will come from. They're worried about how they'll put food on the table or a roof over their heads. Families without work aren't feeling refreshed or happy, like the Minister for Calgary said yesterday. How can this Liberal government be so out of touch with Alberta workers and families?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Canadian government is very preoccupied with the fate of Albertans and the fact that there is massive layoffs and they need support. And we're looking to partner with Alberta and indeed with municipalities across the country facing very real challenges. And we look forward to putting forward a historic plan to invest in infrastructure, to create growth and to support the middle class in this country, as will be presented by the Finance Minister in his upcoming budget.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Monsieur le Président, les chiffres justifient les sentiments de désespoir qui ressentent les travailleurs du secteur des ressources partout au pays. Les familles sans travail ne se sentent pas rassurées ou contentes, comme l'a dit le ministre libéral de Calgary. Si la valeur de votre maison diminue tous les jours, vous ne vous sentez pas non plus rassuré ou content que vous soyez en Alberta, au Nouveau-Brunswick ou au Québec. Pourquoi est-ce que le Premier ministre refuse d'agir et de dire aux travailleurs qu'il va se battre pour la création de nouveaux emplois?
Le Président honorable, Premier ministre.
Monsieur le Président, c'est exactement ce que nous allons faire. Nous avons été élus sur une plateforme qui allait investir dans les communautés, qui allait créer de la croissance pour la classe moyenne, qui allait aider les Canadiens à créer des opportunités à travers le pays. Nous pensons énormément aux gens d'Alberta, Saskatchewan et de Terre-Neuve-Labrador qui souffrent dans le prix du pétrole et nous allons être là pour aider eux et tous les Canadiens avec notre budget qui s'en vient. Merci.
Leader de l'Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, Iran's supreme leader consistently calls for the destruction of Israel, and the Iranian regime is one of the world's worst abusers of human rights. Yet the Liberals say they will be lifting Canadian sanctions on Iran. And why? Because according to the Foreign Affairs Minister, it would be in accordance with our allies. But our allies have also been clear that Canada should leave our CF-18s in the fight against ISIS. So the question for the Prime Minister is this: when do our allies matter and when do they not?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is no question that the world is now a safer place because of the P5+1 deal with Iran. We will continue to work alongside our allies to ensure security in the world and to engage with Iran in a responsible way that highlights both the human rights abuses at home and their sponsorship of terrorism abroad. We need to engage in a respectful, responsible way, and we will do exactly that.
The Honourable Member for Parry Sound, Muskoka.
Monsieur le Président, le plan libéral d'abandonner les sanctions contre l'Iran renverse une position de principe. L'Iran inflige des horribles violations des droits de l'homme contre ses propres citoyens, notamment les femmes et les minorités religieuses. Il supporte le terrorisme et il parle régulièrement de la destruction d'Israël. Pourquoi le gouvernement donne à l'Iran une laissez-passer et compromet les valeurs canadiennes?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Monsieur le Président, nous allons continuer de travailler avec nos alliés pour être engagés de façon responsable dans le monde. On sait très bien que l'Iran est cause pour inquiétude, que ce soit le terrorisme qu'ils incitent, que ce soit le manque de respect pour les droits de l'homme ou que ce soit leurs ambitions nucléaires qui ont été mises de côté par cet accord historique. Nous savons que d'être engagés de façon responsable dans le monde, c'est une façon d'assurer la sécurité et la protection de tous.
Bravo.
Mr. Speaker, while this government is snuggling up to Iran, our allies are going in a very different direction. Reports are that France has asked the European Union to consider new sanctions against Iran over the recent ballistic missile tests. How can this government reduce sanctions at the exact time, that our allies are apparently reconsidering and increasing those very sanctions?
Right Honourable the Prime Minister.
We will continue to work alongside our allies to ensure that we are behaving in a responsible way to move Iran away from its position of violation of human rights, of nuclear ambitions, and indeed of sponsoring terrorism around the world. It is through responsible, firm engagement that Canada has always had an impact in the world, and that's what we will continue to do in a thoughtful and responsible way.
The member for Outremont.
Monsieur le Président, après les 100 premiers jours au pouvoir des libéraux, les Canadiens commencent à se poser des questions. Ils se demandent où sont les actions concrètes promises pendant les élections. On n'a qu'à penser à leurs promesses très claires sur Post Canada. Je cite le Premier ministre. Au niveau de Post Canada, nous nous engageons à restaurer le service à domicile. Est-ce que le Premier ministre est prêt aujourd'hui à nous répéter cette promesse, ou est-ce qu'il va admettre qu'il a déjà renié sa parole?
Premier ministre.
Nous nous sommes engagés pendant la campagne électorale à instaurer un moratoire sur les changements que Post Canada et l'ancien gouvernement conservateur a amenés. Nous travaillons avec les Canadiens et nous allons travailler avec Post Canada pour s'assurer que les Canadiens reçoivent les services dont ils ont besoin, qu'ils veulent avoir, et ce, de façon responsable. Nous allons travailler sur le dossier dans le respect des Canadiens et surtout dans la consultation que l'ancien gouvernement ne faisait jamais.
It's a little bit like selfies, Mr. Speaker. They got cameras everywhere, and we got a clear tape of that Prime Minister making that promise, not the one he just talked about. But for the fun of it, let's read the Liberal Party platform with regards to another Liberal campaign promise. Quote, a Liberal government will restore the eligibility age to 65 for old age security. They said they would do that immediately. The only problem is they said they would do that immediately. There are hundreds of thousands of Canadians living in poverty, Canadian seniors. The government must send a strong signal that they're serious about tackling this unacceptable inequality in Canada. Simple question for the Prime Minister. When does he plan to keep this promise to restore OAS to age 65?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's good to point out that OAS is actually right now at 65 and will continue so for the foreseeable future because of this Liberal government. On top of that, our commitments were made to reach out to seniors, to support seniors, and we're going to be doing that as we will put forward in our budget. We're 100 days into this mandate since the day of the election, and we're already extremely pleased with everything we've accomplished to show Canadians the real change they need. Merci.
Les libéraux avaient promis d'agir pour que les Canadiens puissent avoir accès à une retraite décente. Trop d'aînés vivent dans la pauvreté au pays. L'âge de la retraite a été monté à 67 ans et ça ne va qu'empirer la situation et augmenter les inégalités dans l'avenir. J'essaie encore, parce qu'il a promis de le faire immédiatement. Quand est-ce que le Premier ministre va corriger l'erreur des conservateurs et ramener l'âge de la retraite pour l'avenir à 65 ans comme il a promis de le faire? Est-ce qu'il va le faire, oui ou non?
Premier ministre.
Monsieur le Président, j'aimerais corriger le record. Le gouvernement conservateur, effectivement, avait promis d'augmenter l'âge de la retraite jusqu'à 67 ans, mais ils n'ont pas eu la chance de le faire parce qu'ils prévoyaient le faire en 2023 et ne l'ont pas fait tout de suite. Alors nous allons garder à 65 l'âge de la retraite comme promis et mon cher collègue devrait vérifier ses faits avant de poser une question comme ça.
Bravo! Member for Outremont.
The platform also promised to increase benefits under the Canada and Quebec pension plans. But once in government, they're walking away from their pledge to Canadians hoping to retire in dignity. The Premier of Ontario said she'd scrap her separate pension plan if the feds moved on the CPP. But instead, she's now announced that she's moving ahead with it. So, did the Prime Minister tell the Premier that he's going to break his promise even before he's told Canadians about this broken promise?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Once again, Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to correct the record. Our Finance Minister sat down with all Finance Ministers across the country to talk exactly about enhancing the CPP as we have made that commitment. Ontario had a firm commitment to move forward with that, and they're doing it at the same time as they're working with us to ensure that we are able to enhance the CPP, and our Finance Minister and Finance Ministers across the country are working on that very hard. I thank the member opposite for his question.
Monsieur le Président, on sait maintenant que Bombardier flaire les bonnes affaires et tente de vendre ses avions en Iran. On sait également que des membres des dirigeants de Bombardier ont rencontré des représentants du gouvernement, le ministre des Transports et le ministre des Affaires étrangères. Monsieur le Président, c'est bien simple. Est-ce que le gouvernement peut nous assurer dans cette Chambre que Bombardier ou aucune autre compagnie n'a été averti que les sanctions allaient être annulées et ça avant que ça devienne une position publique? Est-ce que les libéraux ont parlé en secret avec des entreprises pour bénéficier...
Honorable ministre des Affaires étrangères.
Monsieur le Président, nous avons parlé ouvertement de cette question durant la campagne électorale. Le Premier ministre s'est engagé à nous réengager avec l'Iran et nous allons tenir cette promesse en relation étroite avec nos alliés, les yeux ouverts, comme le Premier ministre l'a dit. Mais ma question à mon honorable collègue, pourquoi travaille-t-il pour Airbus plutôt que pour Bombardier?
C'est ça.
Monsieur le Président, j'aimerais rappeler à mon collègue que je suis député de Beauce, je travaille pour les Beaucerons et pour l'ensemble des Canadiens, et j'en suis fier. Monsieur le Président, nous travaillons et nous avons des positions de principe à l'international, et je me demande pourquoi ce gouvernement abandonne ses positions de principe contre l'Iran et abandonne les sanctions contre l'Iran. L'Iran n'a pas changé, Monsieur le Président. L'Iran brime les droits humains de ses propres citoyens, punit les minorités religieuses, commandite le terrorisme. Pourquoi les libéraux changent de position et appuient un État qui finance le terrorisme?
Honorable ministre des Affaires étrangères.
Monsieur le Président, encore une fois, le Premier ministre a très bien répondu à cette question. Mais la question est la suivante. Si le Canada était le seul pays à maintenir l'ensemble des sanctions face à l'Iran, puisque les autres laissent tomber un grand nombre de sanctions, ça ne serait même pas noté en Iran, ça frapperait l'industrie canadienne terriblement. Alors, je demande aux conservateurs de cesser de travailler pour l'industrie européenne et américaine et à commencer à travailler à l'industrie canadienne. Work for the Canadian industry for a change.
That's it.
The honourable member for Niagara West.
Stephen. Mr. Speaker, here's what Putin's foreign minister said in regards to Russia's illegal occupation of Crimea. We have nothing to give back. We are not holding any talks with anyone on returning Crimea. Crimea is the territory of the Russian Federation. Mr. Speaker, why is the Foreign Affairs Minister considering lifting sanctions on Putin's regime, giving Russians blatant disregard to Ukrainian sovereignty?
The Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, this government will strongly support Ukraine. This government will always be against and criticize the Russian invasion and interference in Ukraine, and we will communicate that very clearly to the government of Russia. We'll do it, and I will be pleased to do it because we owe so much to our friendship with Ukraine.
The honourable member for Niagara West.
Mr. Speaker, Putin's regime has invaded and illegally occupied sovereign Ukrainian territory. That, Mr. Speaker, is a fact. Now our Foreign Affairs Minister is cozying up to the Putin regime. Can the Minister of Foreign Affairs please explain why he is abandoning our Ukrainian friends? Why is he giving in to Russian aggression?
That's right.
The Minister of Foreign Affairs.
I already answered to this question, Mr. Speaker, and the Prime Minister did it and said it very clearly to President Putin. So, but the question is, at the worst time of the Cold War, Canada was speaking to Russia. Today, United States is speaking to Russia. Europe is speaking to Russia. Japan is speaking to Russia. You would say that all these countries are letting down Ukraine? In which way it's helping Ukraine that Canada never speak to Russia, even about the Arctic?
Now, the member for Thornhill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As you know, the sanctions imposed against Russia by our Conservative government have been very effective. So effective, in fact, that the Foreign Minister of Russia is appealing now for the normalization of relations between Canada and Putin's regime. Can the Minister of Foreign Affairs tell us today if this government intends to drop sanctions against Russia in the middle of the night, as they did with Iran?
The Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, Canada is certainly able to keep the pressure on Russia and to engage Russia when it is our common interest. We're able to do it because our policy, our foreign policy, will stop to be ideological and irrational and will be effective for our allies and for Canadians.
Bravo. Now the member for Thornhill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, Daphne Meir, a 38-year-old Israeli mother, was stabbed to death in her home in front of her 3 children. This week, 23-year-old Shlomit Krigman was stabbed to death while visiting her grandparents. Now, the U.S. State Department has condemned the wave of deadly attacks against Israeli civilians driven by the Palestinian leadership. But yesterday, the Minister of Foreign Affairs said that a suggestion that he condemn the incitement was partisan politics. Can he explain this unfortunate remark?
Unqualified. Minister of Foreign Affairs.
No, Mr. Speaker, my colleague misinterpreted what I said. I said the opposite. I said we condemn the violence against Israeli people. We'll always do, and to suggest that we are not doing it is partisan.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Hier, le tribunal des droits de la personne a rendu une décision historique en statuant que le gouvernement a fait preuve de discrimination systématique contre les enfants autochtones. C'est le temps, Monsieur le Président, de mettre en œuvre la décision et de corriger cette injustice. La question est simple et elle s'adresse au ministre des Finances. Est-ce que le budget va comprendre les fonds nécessaires pour mettre fin à cette discrimination?
I thank the member for the question and for his tireless advocacy on behalf of his people and all Indigenous children in this country. This ruling is really important because it brings Canadians with us to understand the injustice that has taken place over these years. And yes, we will make significant investments in the future budget to try and rectify this injustice.
Well, the member for Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Cindy Blackstock says Indigenous children have waited too long for justice in this country and they want action now. Unfortunately, the pattern of systemic discrimination continues to be the operating culture within various government departments today. For example, Cindy Blackstock's identified Michael Wernick as a key player in fighting her human rights case. He was also lambasted by parliamentary committee by dragging his feet on the child welfare crisis. For reconciliation to be real, action must be louder than words. So what kind of message is the Prime Minister sending to Indigenous families by appointing Mr. Wernick to oversee the entire civil service?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Minister of Indigenous Affairs.
I thank the member for his question and I thank him for his work on behalf of Indigenous people, but I think that he must understand that the public service in this country's primary goal is loyal implementation. There is a new government here, and the Clerk of the Privy Council is empowered to deliver the work that we have promised in the past election, and he will do it.
The Honourable Member for Foothills.
Mr. Speaker, contrary to what the Liberals may believe, Alberta is facing an economic crisis. They are losing jobs at a rate we have not seen before since, ironically, the Liberals introduced the National Energy Program in the 1980s. When asked about these job losses, the member for Calgary Centre sounded like a Liberal from the 1980s. He said the people he has spoken to feel refreshed with the Prime Minister's failed approach. Refreshed is certainly not the feedback that I'm hearing from Albertans. They are not refreshed to be losing their jobs. They're not refreshed to be losing their homes. Why is the only job that this minister seems to care about is his own.
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, we know that there are job losses across the country in the natural resource sector. We were in New Brunswick only last week, and there were hundreds of jobs lost in a potash mine because of commodity prices. We understand that Alberta is very keen to see natural resources moved in a sustainable way. We can no longer talk about the economy without environmental sustainability, Mr. Speaker. That's the economy of now. That's our way forward.
The Honourable Member for Lakeland.
His position on job losses in Alberta is pathetic. The most the finance minister could say when he visited Calgary recently was that he had a heightened sense of concern about Albertans losing their jobs. And yesterday, the Minister of Veterans Affairs said that Calgarians are refreshed with his government's direction. But really, 100,000 lost jobs and people losing their homes. My constituents in Lakeland are resourceful, but they're not refreshed. Mr. Speaker, was the minister serious? Does he actually think Albertans are happy with his government in charge?
Good question. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, we recognize that the change in oil prices has had a significant impact on Alberta. It's had a significant impact on other parts of the country as well. We have started with a plan that's going to make a difference in this country. We started with tax reductions that are going to help 9 million Canadians to be better off. We're going to move forward with infrastructure investments that will make a significant impact on growth in this country. We want to focus on things that can help in Alberta and in the rest of the country to improve our economy.
The Honourable Member for Red Deer Lacombe.
Mr. Speaker, unemployment is skyrocketing in Alberta. In the riding of Red Deer Lacombe, people are faced with the prospects of losing their homes and their life savings. Some of my constituents are desperate to put food on their table and to pay their mortgage. They don't want to be left out in the cold. However, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Veterans Affairs yesterday callously referred to these as refreshing times. Does he think it's refreshing to lose your home in Alberta in January?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, we know that the natural resource sector accounts for about 1.8 million jobs in Canada. It accounts for many, many, many jobs in Alberta, and many of those jobs have been lost. We recognize that this is an extremely challenging situation. We are working to put in our budget measures that will improve the situation in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland, and other parts across this country so we can deal with this enormous challenge.
Yes. Honourable Member for Carlton Trail Eagle Creek.
Mr. Speaker, every day the fine print of the Liberal platform becomes more and more devastating to Canada's economy. We've recently heard announcements from CP and WestJet. This Liberal government's silence on the job losses in Alberta and Saskatchewan and the resulting impact on the transportation sector is deafening. Will the member from Wascana continue to remain silent, or will he stand up and support Western Canadian jobs?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, we are focused on how we can help Canadians across this country with a challenged global economy. We are particularly focused on how we can help those people in the parts of our country that are so deeply impacted by the change in global oil prices. We are working diligently to figure out the priorities of Canadians so that in our budget we can address these issues by helping Albertans, Saskatchewans, people in Newfoundland and across the country.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Le gouvernement n'a toujours pas procédé à aucune consultation prébudgétaire au Parlement, comme c'est le cas d'habitude. À la place, il utilise le site Web du Parti libéral pour consulter les gens et, sûrement par hasard, pour ramasser des données pouvant être utilisées pour la collecte de fonds partisans. L'économie est au ralenti, les pertes d'emplois se multiplient, mais 38 % de ceux qui cotisent ne peuvent avoir accès à l'assurance emploi. Au lieu de se servir, le gouvernement peut-il venir en aide immédiatement à ceux qui sont dans le besoin et créer un seuil universel d'admissibilité à l'assurance emploi de 360 heures?
Bravo!
Merci, Monsieur President. Gives me an opportunity to talk about our government's plan to help Canadians in a situation that is very serious for those that are facing it most acutely in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland. There's inherent barriers in the EI system that we promised to take care of and address immediately, and that will happen very soon.
The honourable member for Churchill-Kiewatinook-Askey.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians want answers on timelines, and if the Liberals were actually consulting with Canadians on the budget, they would know that they are hurting. The economy is slowing, but only 38% of Canadians who are out of work are eligible for EI. Instead of speeches to millionaires in Switzerland, Canadians want to see real action.
The honourable member for Lakeland.
On job losses in Alberta is pathetic. The most the finance minister could say when he visited Calgary recently was that he had a heightened sense of concern about Albertans losing their jobs. And yesterday, the Minister of Veterans Affairs said that Calgarians are refreshed with his government's direction. But really, 100,000 lost jobs and people losing their homes. My constituents in Lakeland are resourceful, but they're not refreshed. Mr. Speaker, was the minister serious? Does he actually think Albertans are happy with this government in charge?
Good question. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, we recognize that the change in oil prices has had a significant impact on Alberta. It's had a significant impact on other parts of the country as well. We have started with a plan that's going to make a difference in this country. We started with tax reductions that are going to help 9 million Canadians to be better off. We're going to move forward with infrastructure investments that will make a significant impact on growth in this country. We want to focus on things that can help in Alberta and in the rest of the country to improve our economy.
The honourable member for Red Deer Lacombe.
Mr. Speaker, unemployment is skyrocketing in Alberta. In the riding of Red Deer Lacombe, people are faced with the prospects of losing their homes and their life savings. Some of my constituents are desperate to put food on their table and to pay their mortgage. They don't want to be left out in the cold. However, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Veterans Affairs yesterday callously referred to these as refreshing times. Does he think it's refreshing to lose your home in Alberta in January?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, we know that the natural resource sector accounts for about 1.8 million jobs in Canada. It accounts for many, many, many jobs in Alberta, and many of those jobs have been lost. We recognize that this is an extremely challenging situation. We are working to put in our budget measures that will improve the situation in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland, and other parts across this country so we can deal with this enormous challenge.
Yes. Honourable member for Carleton Trail Eagle Creek.
Mr. Speaker, every day the fine print of the Liberal platform becomes more and more devastating to Canada's economy. We've recently heard announcements from CP and WestJet. This Liberal government's silence on the job losses in Alberta and Saskatchewan and the resulting impact on the transportation sector is deafening. Will the member from Wascana continue to remain silent, or will he stand up and support Western Canadian jobs?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, we are focused on how we can help Canadians across this country with a challenged global economy. We are particularly focused on how we can help those people in the parts of our country that are so deeply impacted by the change in global oil prices. We are working diligently to figure out the priorities of Canadians so that in our budget we can address these issues by helping Albertans, Saskatchewans, people in Newfoundland and across the country.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Le gouvernement n'a toujours pas procédé à aucune consultation prébudgétaire au Parlement, comme c'est le cas d'habitude. À la place, il utilise le site Web du Parti libéral pour consulter les gens et, sûrement par hasard, pour ramasser des données pouvant être utilisées pour la collecte de fonds partisans. L'économie est au ralenti, les pertes d'emplois se multiplient, mais 38% de ceux qui cotisent ne peuvent avoir accès à l'assurance-emploi. Au lieu de se servir, le gouvernement peut-il venir en aide immédiatement à ceux qui sont dans le besoin et créer un seuil universel d'admissibilité à l'assurance-emploi de 360 heures?
Bravo! Minister of Employment.
Merci, Monsieur President. Gives me an opportunity to talk about our government's plan to help Canadians in a situation that is very serious for those that are facing it most acutely in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland. There's inherent barriers in the EI system that we promised to take care of and address immediately, and that will happen very soon.
The honourable member for Churchill Kiiwetinoong-Aski.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians want answers on timelines, and if the Liberals were actually consulting with Canadians on the budget, they would know that they are hurting. The economy is slowing, but only 38% of Canadians who are out of work are eligible for EI. Instead of speeches to millionaires in Switzerland, Canadians want to see real action in their own communities. So will the government expand access to EI immediately by creating a universal threshold of 360 hours?
Minister of Employment.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. We have indicated to all Canadians that we are reviewing the EI system. It's inherently unfair. It penalizes, in particular, those re-entrants and new entrants into the EI system, and it's our intention, as promised, to address it as soon as possible.
The honourable member for Etobicoke Centre.
Mr. Speaker, by militarily invading and annexing Crimea and continuously sending soldiers and lethal military equipment into the Donbass, the Kremlin has not only violated European borders, but has also broken all international agreements on the sanctity of borders. Recently, the Prime Minister made clear Canada's position to Russia's president. Can the Foreign Affairs Minister share with this House the government's position on Russia's continued illegal occupation of Ukrainian territory?
The Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, the traveling that I was planning for a while to Ukraine will be true 4 days from now, and I'm so pleased to be in Ukraine, to express to the government of Ukraine the steadfast support of Canada for Ukraine, and how much we deeply disagree with the invasion and interference of the Russian government in Ukraine, and also how much we will not tolerate from a Russian minister any insult against the community of Ukraine in Canada. Ukrainian Canadians, we owe so much to them, we will always support them.
The honourable member for Calgary-Nose Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The United States Senate is holding a hearing entitled Canada's Fast-Track Refugee Plan, Unanswered Questions and Implications for U.S. National Security. It's our understanding that government representatives may have received an invitation to participate in the hearing, but have in fact declined. Can the minister explain to Canadians why they would decline this opportunity to be transparent, open, and accountable?
Good question. The Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, the Government of Canada is transparent, open and accountable in this House. This is the Parliament of Canada, and this is where we respond to the questions like Canadian security. We have put in place layers of security activity to ensure that our refugee initiative with respect to Syria can be successful. The program is working well, and indeed it will result in something that Canadians can be very, very proud of.
Honourable member for Calgary-Nose Hill.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure our allies to the south will find that answer very interesting, and I also find it interesting because I believe that my colleague here, the former President of the Treasury Board, actually appeared at a Senate committee hearing to testify in June of this year. So that begs the question, since there's still time for the Canadian government to send a representative to this hearing, will the minister explain to Canadians this new precedent they're setting, what they're trying to hide from both Canadian citizens and our American allies?
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, there's absolutely nothing to hide because we have completely briefed the Department of Homeland Security. We've completely briefed the U.S. Ambassador to Canada, and there is a very open line of communication directly to the White House. They understand exactly the layers of security screening that are put in place, from the activity with the UNHCR through the the personal interviews that are done, to the collection of biometrics, to the checking against international databases to ensure that this project is done safely and successfully, a very strong humanitarian credit to Canada.
Honourable member for Markham Unionville.
Mr. Speaker, some Syrian refugees have been stuck in cramped temporary accommodations for weeks. They say there is hardly any communications from the government. Also, we are hearing reports of low-income Canadians being asked to leave their housing to make room for the Syrian refugees. Will the Minister apologize to Canadians and refugees for his failure to provide long-term living solutions for Syrian refugees, because refugees are people, not number on a scorecard?
Honourable Minister of Immigration and Refugees.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for Markham Unionville for that question. I can assure him and I can assure Canadians that the vast majority of these refugees are super happy to be in this country, as they've expressed to the media, as they've expressed to me. And yes, in the course of accepting thousands of new Canadians, everything will not be perfect at every instant, and there are some issues in hotels which we are dealing with, but it is perfectly normal for refugees to spend some weeks in hotels before going on to their permanent accommodation, and all the workers and all the Canadians and all the levels of government and all the volunteers are doing.
This exchanging of riding names is confusing for the Speaker. The honourable member for Markham Unionville.
Mr. Speaker, the Parliamentary Secretary for Immigration is on the record saying that the government's policy is to, quote, treat Syrian refugees differently than refugees from the other parts of the world. Can the Minister confirm that this is the government's policy and explain if being treated differently means being stuck in the temporary cramped housing for weeks?
The Minister of Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians across this land are welcoming with open arms and open hearts these Syrian refugees. They are proceeding quickly to their housing. Yes, they are spending some time in hotels. That is normal for the process. And it is also the case that refugee applicants from other countries are proceeding as planned. So Canadians can be reassured that this operation is a great success, and we will soon have 25,000 new Canadians on our soil.
Honourable member for Saskatoon West.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians are proud of our public health care system. A central principle of our public system is that people's access to health care does not depend on one's ability to pay. But while the Canada Health Act outlaws user fees, Saskatchewan is now allowing those who can afford to get special access to private MRIs. Why won't the Health Minister act? Will she enforce the Canada Health Act in Saskatchewan and across the country to crack down on these private payments, yes or no?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to further inform the House about the excellent meetings that I had last week with the health ministers from across the country, all the provinces and territories. And among the things that we discussed was our commitment to the Canada Health Act. As the member opposite is aware, that Act is one of the foundations of a system that we're proud of. And one of the pieces of that of which I'm most proud is the fact that we are determined to make sure that Canadians will always be able to access the appropriate care that they require based on need and not based on ability to pay. And we will do all that is in our power to uphold that Act.
L'honorable député de Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagotte.
Monsieur le Président, il faut plus que des discussions, il faut des actions pour préserver l'accessibilité aux soins de santé au pays. Des milliers de Québécois ont dénoncé la légalisation des frais accessoires au Québec. 300 $ pour des gouttes ophtalmologiques, 500 $ pour une coloscopie. Il est inacceptable que les moyens déterminent l'accès aux soins. Quelles actions, et je dis bien quelles actions, la ministre va-t-elle prendre pour assurer à tous les Québécois le même accès aux soins de santé, peu importe leur revenu?
Honorable ministre de Santé.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased that the member opposite is so committed to making sure that Canadians will have access to the care that they need when they need it on the basis of that need, and I will support her in that commitment. I one of the fundamental principles that I will go forward in my work with my colleagues is to establish a strong relationship, which I'm pleased to say that I was able to do. I will continue working with the health ministers across the country, including the health minister from Quebec and other provinces and territories, in order to address the concerns of Canadians.
The honourable member for Grande Prairie Mackenzie.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a couple of questions for the Minister of Agriculture. The first one is I'm wondering if you can confirm to this House that the Ethics Commissioner has cleared his Chief of Staff to serve in her new capacity. I also wonder if he can confirm to this House if or not his new Chief of Staff has got the RCMP's security clearances necessary to do her job. Yes or no?
The Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My Chief of Staff is extremely qualified for the job and is dedicated to serving the best interests of the entire agricultural sector and all Canadians. She is following the guidelines laid out by the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner and will fully comply with any advice provided by the non-partisan Commissioner. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Grande Prairie Mackenzie.
Well, thank you. I'll take that as a no. So the second very straightforward question I ask the Minister of Agriculture, is the Minister aware of any past criminal charges involving his Chief of Staff that may lead Canadians to believe that she's not suitable for the job that she's now tasked to do? Yes.
The honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am proud that she has a strong agricultural background. And Mr. Speaker, it's a pillar in her community. It's a pillar in her community and brings a deep commitment to agriculture. And as you all know, all appropriate information will be publicly available on the Ethics Commissioner's public website. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Barrie, Springwater, Laurel, Medonte.
A Liberal candidate in Alberta said pipelines make Canada America's dirty gas tank. That candidate is now the Chief of Staff to the Minister of the Environment. Another Liberal candidate from Quebec wants Ontario to transition away from manufacturing. That candidate is the Prime Minister of Canada. Why does the Liberal government oppose oil sands in the West, energy east, and manufacturing right here in Ontario?
Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, we realize that a very strong natural resource sector is so important to the future of the Canadian economy. We also have a mandate to make sure that those projects end up at Tidewater and export markets with the public confidence of Canadians through a robust environmental assessment process. That is a serious promise to Canadians that we intend to uphold.
Monsieur le Président, comme le savent mes collègues, aujourd'hui a lieu la journée causée pour la cause de Belle, une initiative qui a vu le jour il y a 6 ans pour sensibiliser les gens au sujet des enjeux de santé mentale. Les Canadiens savent que nous devons prendre soin de notre santé mentale, tout comme notre santé physique. La ministre de la Santé peut-elle nous offrir une mise à jour sur l'engagement du gouvernement envers l'amélioration de santé mentale des Canadiens?
Madame la ministre de la Santé.
Monsieur le Président, en tant que médecin de famille et ministre de la Santé, je suis engagée à travailler avec nos partenaires afin d'améliorer la santé mentale des Canadiens et rendre ces services plus accessibles. Notre gouvernement fait de la santé mentale une priorité et nous continuerons nos investissements pour promouvoir une saine santé mentale et contribuer à la prévention de la maladie mentale et du suicide.
Honorable député de Beauport-Limoilou.
Monsieur le Président, encore à ce jour, nous attendons que les promesses faites par les libéraux en ce qui a trait aux anciens combattants se concrétisent. Parallèlement, il est important de préciser que les nouvelles mesures promises seront financées à même des déficits annuels et répétitifs. Ainsi, je demande au ministre des anciens combattants comment entend-il assurer la viabilité à long terme de ces promesses alors que le gouvernement prévoit faire des déficits structurels?
The Honourable Minister of Veterans Affairs.
Well, thank you very much for the question. I can tell you that I have an aggressive mandate from my Prime Minister in dealing with Veterans Affairs. We have 15 different commitments that we've made to veterans to see them get the the care, compassion, and respect that they deserve for serving our country, whether that's through more opportunities in the workforce, more opportunities for education, more opportunities their families succeed. That's what we promised, and that's what we're going to deliver.
The honourable member for Hamilton Mountain.
Mr. Speaker, the Ontario Court of Appeal just ruled that the secret sell-all deal signed by the Conservatives in the U.S. Steel can be released. Steelworkers in the city of Hamilton have been fighting for years to unseal this deal. And with bankruptcy proceedings ongoing and the retirement security of 20,000 workers and pensioners at stake, it's more critical than ever. Now that they can't hide behind the courts, will the Prime Minister live up to the Liberal commitment to release the deal and finally stand up for workers and pensioners?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, to the honourable member for his question, the government is aware of the decision by the court that just came out yesterday morning. We're taking our time to study the decision, and we will be happy to follow the recommendations of the court. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable député de Saint-Boniface, Saint-Vital.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Les organismes à but non lucratif de nos communautés préparent déjà leur programmation d'été et passeront bientôt à l'embauche d'emplois pour la période estivale. Est-ce que la ministre de l'Emploi, du Développement de la main-d'œuvre et du Travail peut confirmer quels programmes sont disponibles aux organisations à but non lucratif et aux petites entreprises?
Honorable ministre de l'Emploi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and my honourable friend and member from St. Boniface, that I'm proud to announce that, of course, we are in the process of ramping up the number of Canada student jobs, and in fact, they are available for nonprofits and small business. Small business has, in fact, been priorized which is unusual, priorized as one of the national priorities in the Canada summer jobs. So please go out and hire a young person, give them the work experience that they need.
Honourable member for Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I want to thank the Minister for wishing me a happy 39th birthday yesterday. I was, however, less happy with her response to my question why the government won't hold a referendum. She said the conversation is, quote, more complex than a simple yes or no answer. Now, the government can characterize its consultation process any way it wants, but when the process is over, the government has to write a law for their no electoral system. So let me ask the Minister now a question that really can't be answered with a yes or a no. Will she submit that law to Canadians in a referendum, yes or no?
Honourable Minister of Democratic Institutions.
Mr. Speaker, I'm certainly glad that the member opposite was born, and I would like to assure him that I'll be working hard with my colleague, the government House Leader, to convene a parliamentary committee to examine a wide range of electoral reform options, and it is not wise to predetermine the outcome of that consultation process.
Now that's this pleasant spirit we like in the House. Honorable député de Mirabel.
Monsieur le Président, on apprenait récemment que dans la dernière année, 257 fermes laitières ont été forcées de mettre la clé dans la porte sur le territoire national du Québec. 257 fermes, c'est pas rien. Il s'agit de familles, d'hommes et de femmes qui sont essentiels au développement des régions. C'est maintenant que nos producteurs laitiers ont besoin du soutien du fédéral. Est-ce que le ministre va s'attaquer dès maintenant au volume grandissant d'importation de protéines laitières?
The Minister of Agriculture.
Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate my honourable colleague's question. And of course, any farms that are closing, if it's through financial reasons, is most unfortunate, but a lot of amalgamation. But I can assure my honourable colleague in this House that this government fully supports supply management.
I would like to draw to the attention of honourable members the presence in the gallery of Mr. Achim Steiner, Undersecretary General of the United Nations.